Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to talk to this panel. I've met Michaela for the first time, but Bryan and Vashti I've known a long time. And I really do appreciate that the Society of Illustrators is doing this, because even though diversity is a huge topic in publishing now, all of us have been creating stories that have been infused with our experiences long before it became hot, I think. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk to the panel about, is how they channel their experience into their books. So thank you, Society of Illustrators, not just for this phenomenal original art exhibit. And if you haven't seen it, you really need to check it out, because every year it provides so much inspiration. I bring my classes. And one of the reasons is because when you look at other people's artwork, it rubs off on you. It informs you, and it helps you do your own artwork. I think not only does it inspire you, but sometimes it motivates you. You know, I never leave one of those exhibits without feeling like getting to work. So we all learn from each other, and it's in more areas than just art, you know, because we're all shaped by our experience. So what I have found, and Vashti's going to have to back me up on this, because I understand that you studied psychology, but I think we're all shaped by the time we're 5 or 6. We're shaped by our experience of the world, and we pretty much have formed our personality by then. So I know that how you see yourself is a large part of it is shaped by what you've seen in TV shows or movies or advertising or in the books that you've read. And so you've already kind of made an impression on yourself, your sense of how you fit into this world. And so diversity for us, and I think for everyone, should be more than just a buzzword. And right now, it's really wonderful that publishers are focused on this. And that's something that we're going to explore a bit, because I don't think for any of us, if you singularly try to imagine yourself in a world where you don't see yourself represented, it would be very strange, you know. And we all like diversity in styles and media when it comes to the art show. And certainly I know in food, when we're eating, we like to go, you know, have Mexican one night and pizza the next and Chinese the next. I'm sorry, a lot of my analogies do traipse off into food. I'm sorry about that. I want to introduce the panelists briefly. And what I'm going to do is say a little bit about each one of them, and then turn the floor over to them, because I would like to hear about the books that they have done, particularly the ones in the show, what their motivation was behind some of that, and how they channeled their own, you know, personal experiences into it. And then I'm going to have some questions for them, and then we're going to open up to a Q&A. So if you do have questions, you should put them into the chat, and we'll be getting to that after everybody's had a chance to answer some questions. But first, I wanted to introduce them very briefly. I'm not going to give you all of their stories. I want to give you some of their awards, because I don't think they'll probably, you know, blow their own horns. I think they probably won't tell you about their awards. But started with Michaela Goade, who did the beautiful book, We Are Water Protectors. She's a 2020 Kirkus Prize finalist, 2020 shortlist for the Sheila Berry Best Canadian Picture Book of the Year. And in 2018, she won the American Indian Youth Literature Award for Best Picture Book. What I loved when I was doing a little bit of research on you, Michaela, your favorite color is ocean. And I thought, how cool is that? You know? But one of the things I like to do is take a look at the reviews that people have written about the books, people who actually, you know, get what it is you're trying to do. And one of the things that Publishers Weekly said that I thought was really cool was that observation's not enough. Your book communicates that action is necessary, and it's a passionate call for environmental stewardship. I think we're all concerned about the environment, so it was a healthy, beautiful addition to any literature on that topic. And one review that I really liked said it will make readers reflect and think about their own connectedness to water and whether or not they are a water protector. And this is what books ideally will do, is move us to take action or to feel like this is something that we can get involved with, right? It's a great representation of protest and standing together for what is right. And I loved this part. Lastly, the illustrations are phenomenal. So what illustrator wouldn't want to hear that, right? Each page is a work of art. It's a beautiful book. I wanted to introduce Bryan. Bryan's piece in the show is from All Because You Matter, which was written by Tammy Charles. Okay, Bryan, he is a 6-time Coretta Scott Award winner and 4 Caldecott honors under your belt. And you have to explain this to me later, an instant New York Times bestseller. That's even better, I guess, than being a New York Times bestseller. You're an instant New York Times bestseller. Okay. One of the things I also found out was he's a Pratt graduate like I am, and that even while you were at Pratt, you were doing volunteer work with kids in Harlem, doing art projects.
Yes.
Working with the art community. He won his very first book, won the Ezra Jack Keats New Illustrator Award. It was called Uptown. And I think it's so touching because from what I understand, The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats had a big influence on you when you were a little kid, right?
True, yes.
And when I was looking at his reviews, the review of this book said it was a heart-lifting love letter to Black and brown children everywhere, reminding them how much they matter, they've always mattered, and they always will matter. And I thought that was lovely. But somebody focused down on the art. And this is something I'd love for you guys to touch on too when you talk about your books. What you put into it, the thought you put into it, because they said, Publishers Weekly said, the universal declarations are often illustrated with images of many children. This book focuses on a single child and brings his experience and life and the ways they matter right up close. And I know that was an artistic choice to focus on one child. And Vashti, who I think one of your best known books is Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History, has been on the New York Times bestselling list all the time, every book. I'm not going to say it gets tiring. It can't get tiring. But she has won the NAACP Image Award. You have a history of filmmaking, script writing. She studied film, video, art history, psychology, and economics. And what I found really interesting was it said that you want to do a graphic novel and that you also want to do an illustrated middle grade novel. So you do a little bit of everything, animation, video, and books. And so I'm now referring to you as genre fluid, okay? Just a little bit of everything. But when I was reading reviews of Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History, I thought this was a really interesting point. A woman wrote that she's white and she bought it for a friend's daughter who's white. And she said, I never had books about Black leaders growing up. I think it's utterly important for white kids to learn about how Black people have contributed to our culture. I never learned much about that in school as a kid. Teaching kids from a young age conditions them to see all people as equally capable and deserving of respect, and representation matters. She loves the books, this little girl that she gave it to, and she loves sharing what she's learned with other students in the class. And I think that's a perfect lead-in, because my first question to the panel is to talk about your books and what experience you bring to it, because I know you can't escape your own experience. This is like your handwriting or your accent. So your experience is always showing up in your work. But to what extent do your experiences show up in your books? Can you give us some examples and why you chose the piece that you did to be in the show? And we're going to start with Michaela.
Here. I apologize if there's any background noise. They're sort of on and off doing some construction next door. So for the way that the books I work on, how they reflect my experiences, it really depends on the book. Backing up a little bit to 2016, 2017 is when I started illustrating books. I came to it from graphic design and just like a lifetime of art, but really I hadn't planned to go this route. And the first books I worked on were with our tribal organization, our cultural nonprofit. And so the stories really, was Native stories by Native people for Native people. So it was much regional or targeted audience. And it was all place-based here in Southeast Alaska. So I started by working on books that really reflected my experience, whether it was just the landscapes or the culture or the stories. And that really helped build up some of my illustration skills, because they started really from nothing. And then I got, some more book deals from there, Encounter, and then We Are Water Protectors. And I started working with authors from different Native nations, from different backgrounds. And it became a little bit more challenging to work my experiences into it, because, the Native community isn't just a monolith community. There's over 500 federally recognized nations, tribes in our sovereign tribes, sovereign nations in our country, and then hundreds of unofficial. It's still important, just federally not recognized. And so that's a lot of different experiences, a lot of cultures, a lot of histories, a lot of languages. And I was being partnered up with authors from different regions. And so for We Are Water Protectors, was written by my friend Carol Lindstrom, and she's from the Turtle Mountain, Ojibwe. And, you know, it was a little bit challenging. All the authors I've worked on have been really great in saying, you know, it doesn't have to be specific. It can be, you know, you can bring in your own experiences if you want. I've found it to be inspiring and important to root it as much as I can in the author's culture, while bringing in my own perspective, and just as a way to sort of honor the author's experience. Because I would feel strange to take their text and completely spin it into my Southeast Alaskan Tlingit background. So sometimes I'm looking for a merging or where we can find that commonality, and oftentimes it's with land. So a lot of my work is really inspired by the land and our relationship to the land. And so for We Are Water Protectors, that was pretty apparent just in the theme of the book. And so, you know, at the core of it is a love letter to the land and our relationship to the land and to its waters. And, you know, at the time when I was making this book, I had a little studio right by the ocean, and I had like a little 100-yard walk from our cabin to the studio, and there were only like a few other people who lived out in this little remote spot. And it was just this beautiful time, and I'll always really cherish this time making this book, because each book has its own little like time capsule. And so just working that spirituality into the book was really beautiful for me. And then because Standing Rock wasn't just one Native nation, it was, you know, the coming together of many from around the world. I wanted to represent as many as I could. So themes of community and unity, and then diversity within that unity were all things I tried to focus on, which can sometimes be a little or sometimes a lot of pressure. Just you want to get things right, and I don't want to disrespect, I don't want to misrepresent, because, you know, there's a history of erasure and misrepresentation with any, you know, stories that deal with the Native people or indigenous cultures. There's such a history of erasure and just being excluded or completely or just misrepresented and harmful stereotypes. So you always have to be aware of that, and know that I don't always have these lived experiences of the communities I'm representing. And so I just have to walk carefully and as respectfully as I can. And then hopefully, you know, in the future, there's more and more Native Indigenous illustrators. So as soon as there are more, you know, there's more, you can get, easily get a Cherokee illustrator and a Cherokee author, and that's awesome. And I think we're headed in that direction. It's just like you said, it's more and more publishers are paying greater attention, which is a good thing. So
Great, thank you. Bryan, what about you? Can you tell us about the piece that you've got in the show? And
yes, it's the cover here, All Because You Matter, written by Tammy Charles. And Tammy, the author, she wrote this text on celebrating the birth of her son, who was now 11 years old when we actually did the book. But, you know, she talked about that talk that we as parents, we have to have with our kids about the world that we're bringing our children into, and how sometimes there'll be dark days, sometimes it'll feel like, you know, it's just tough, or you're not quite sure. But we celebrate the fact that every child really matters. And there was a place that somebody prayed to make a space for you on the planet even before you got here. So what I tried to do with that whole notion that I totally believe in, I totally really surrendered, you know, to that notion. I said, well, okay, so when each of us we walk into a room, we walk with everybody that's ever loved us, that ever thought about us. So in the imagery, you'll see voices and chants and faces of the ancestors and everybody that make our world. And that's, so you're never really, really alone, you know? And it's a conversation you probably don't have much with your kids or with young people, but it's a powerful notion to know that we've been expecting you. The planet has been expecting you. And we've always been waiting for you. And there's a wonderful place with just your name on it. It's yours, and everywhere you walk with us all. So it's a wonderful notion. It's a place of empowerment. And then it also connected. We did this book almost 2 years ago when we first started talking about it. You open up the book and you look out the window. It's the mirror image of what's happening outside with Black Lives Matter and all the gun violence and all the things that happen to Black and brown children, especially. Because right now it probably feels like their lives don't matter, or it's marginalized at best. So it's the kickoff point for that conversation. Tammy knew she had to let this book come out because she had to have those talks with her son that was growing up into a world, and he's questioning the world around him. Like, I think she always talks about a conversation she had with her son when they were learning about Dr. Martin Luther King. And her son said, well, if he was such a good guy, why did people hurt him? How did he get hurt? So that's the point. Okay, you got to have that conversation with that Black and brown boy about what's happening out here in this world. Or if you feel uncomfortable, you see, I'm the artist and illustrator when I do a school visit, and I start talking, and then I just pause. I said, "Oh, I see you because somebody told you don't feel comfortable in your own skin. Somebody tried to convince you that you don't matter. Somebody said there's not a place for you." Well, we're here to sell every book that I've ever done. We celebrating the mere fact that you matter. And my art reflects that because I embody that spirit of it. No matter who's the author, I try to embody it and celebrate it and then expand it. That's my visual storyline that I bring to it, to expand that whole idea. That's where we got all this stuff, because it was never written in the text like that. But me interpreting the text and having the words fall across me, and then me to bring it back out and show you what it feels like when I read the text, what it sounds like when I read the text, and what it tastes like when I read the text. And I'm trying to visually show you all the flavor, all the senses are wide open, and to tell you what this is like. And then the gaze of the beautiful brown boy, this celebrate just the beauty. He don't have to move. His hair was cut already. He brought everything to it. All the beauty was already there. It's my job to get out of the way and be a vessel and let it flow. And that's what I try to do with the books.
I love it. Just get out of the way and let it happen.
Yeah, it's already beautiful.
I would love it if my books would happen like that. I'll just get out of the way and let them just happen. You make it sound, but it does. It comes naturally. Vashti, what about you?
Well, I don't have a piece in the show. I was very lucky to be a judge this year, so I got to see everyone's art and got to vote for your art. So, but I can talk about my book, Little Leaders. I can talk a little bit about what I put into it, because this was the first book that I wrote and illustrated at a time when I did not think I would ever become an author or an illustrator. I came up with the idea first as sort of just a challenge for myself. It was Black History Month of 2017. This part of the story I don't always tell, but I found myself kind of like censoring the story, but I'm kind of not going to continue to censor myself. So in January of 2017, we saw the inauguration of our president, and I felt like upset, full of frustration and kind of sadness. And Black History Month was coming around, and I thought, okay, this year I want to do something different. I had just gotten back into illustrating, which was something I did throughout my childhood, but kind of picked up again when I was in film school. I wanted to create a drawing challenge for myself, to just force myself to draw something every day. And treat that Black History Month a little differently. I really wanted to, you know, challenge myself to learn more and just celebrate something really special. And I felt like, well, there's a lot of negativity on the news. What might be the antidote to that? For me, at least, some amazing Black women. So every day for the month of Black History Month, I'm going to choose a Black woman and write about her and illustrate her and post it on my social media. And fortunately, people were really excited about it. I felt like when I looked into the history, I looked up the history of Black History Month. Turns out it was founded in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson. And the goal was to celebrate the stories that have been long neglected throughout history. So I thought to myself, like, wow, okay, definitely Black women have been doubly neglected throughout history. But I wanted to challenge myself to learn about people who I didn't necessarily hear about growing up. I feel like we kind of heard a lot of the same stories kind of repeated year after year. And I really wanted to force myself to delve into that history and think about these people and not just as these figures. So I started with Sojourner Truth, who I knew of as like an abolitionist and a women's rights activist, but I hadn't really thought about her story as this real person, as this woman, as a mother. And it was just so overwhelming to me to like think about her story and learn about it. And I was just weeping at like 3 o'clock in the morning doing this drawing. And I knew it was going to be something special. Fortunately, lots of people agreed, and I was able to turn it into a book. So that was February of 2017. Before the year was over, the book was out. And I learned so much about myself and what I wanted to create for this world for young people. And I was thinking at that time, since this was my first book, I really was delving into like, what was the book that I needed as a young reader? What was the book that a young Black girl like Vashti would have needed? So I really wanted to make sure that there were stories that were inspiring for every type of kid. I mean, we often ask kids, far too often, what do they want to be when they grow up? And that question wasn't always so exciting or helpful for me. So I wanted to kind of arm kids with the knowledge of all these different people that came before them from so many different fields of study, so that when they are ready to answer that question, they'll know about like Gwendolyn Brooks and I don't know, let's see, Raven Wilkinson, just, you know, artists, activists, sure, doctors and lawyers too, but everything in between. And then the last bit that's really about like what I was thinking about going into this book and about that reflection of myself was I could have drawn each of these people to look like themselves, but instead I created this little kid character. I wanted it to look like it was this child dressing up as these famous people, because I really wanted to create something that felt sweet and beautiful and innocent and maybe like so pretty that you'll want to pick it up and read it. Because history wasn't that exciting to me when I was a kid, but you know, it was exciting, really pretty pictures. So I wanted to create something that felt like it was warm and comforting, and a book that just felt like so nice that it would go on the shelf right next to like Winnie the Pooh or Alice in Wonderland, the books that, you know, are the classics, the ones that many people grow up with. I didn't see reflections of myself in those books. And so I wanted to create something that went right there. And when people looked at it, they saw Black girls and thought they're just as cute as Winnie the Pooh. So there was a lot of thinking, particularly in the art, going into that. And to reference what you said about the quote or the review that someone left, you know, on the book, as much as I want little Black girls to be able to open up this book and like see a reflection of themselves in any one of the pictures, I really want this book to function. I mean, in the classic like Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop quote, like books should be windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. I want it to be a mirror for that little Vashti that needed to see herself. But I also want it to be a window for other children to look and see all of the wonderful contributions that Black women have made to American history, and, you know, find a different type of reflection for yourself, a different type of opportunity, and learn about these different experiences. So I hope that it functions on all of those levels.
I think it does. I think it does. I think all of your books do, because it's so important to be able to speak to kids, and your imagery is what is really pulling them into the books. Do you know what I mean? And that's where they're going to find the information. But you're right, because otherwise every February we're learning about, Harriet Tubman, and that's pretty much it. And so to get this information out, or to have kids feel empowered, with information and with something they can do, like about the water, protecting the water. I think whatever you do in a picture book, you have to keep in mind the audience and how ready to be active they are. You know what I mean? I find little first graders to be so fair about everything, and they care about everything. And so you're catching them at just a perfect age when they're little sponges, For all of you, diversity is the norm. That's obvious. But when you get approached by a publisher, do you feel that it is liberating to be able to work within your culture, to reflect your culture, to show, the ancestors and all your influences? Or do you feel sometimes that you're being put into a lane? Is that what's expected of you? Is it mandatory, in fact? Have you ever thought, I'm just going to do a story about a frog, and you feel like you might get some pushback from that? Or do you want to always stay in this particular lane where you're really exploring your culture? And this is for all of you, so you can all on mic and just chime in as you please. Do you feel that you're put in a lane and that you need to stay there, want to stay there, or have to stay there?
Well, my position is that, and okay, I've been making books for 22 years. In the very beginning, when you're first trying to figure it all out as a new author or illustrator, you sort of take what's given to you. And if you have success there, then more of those type of projects sort of come to your way as an illustrator. For instance, I did Martin's Big Words, which was really big, and it's really always doing well for 20 years. And when I first did that book and finished it and it did well, I got a slew of offers to do biopics like that. All of the biopics that Doreen Rappaport has written since then, really, they were all for me. I was supposed to do all of those, from Abraham Lincoln to Walt Disney to, I think she even had a Jesus one, one time, but what I sort of said to myself is, I said, okay, I've done this sort of format of a book, and then I wanted something else. So I did two. I did Martin's Big Words and John Lennon in that same format, big face on the cover, and within it telling the story in a certain way. I was getting from all over the place offers to do that because it was successful. But for me, it didn't. I was trying to stretch, and so that's a decision as an artist you have to make. Okay, it's already unpredictable to be an illustrator, try to make a living at it. Now you're turning down work. Now, is that ego, or are you trying to stretch? If you want to stretch, do you want to also reap the repercussions of sometimes the work gets thin and you're out of work? So you got to have, it's a balancing act. But fortunately for me, I had other interests within books, and I'm always up for a challenge for something I haven't done. And so I weigh all that against the.
You muted yourself. You're muted, Bryan. Okay.
Oh, maybe he doesn't know how to. Oh, there
Okay, I'm done.
Okay.
What about you guys? Michaela, Vashti?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I have so many answers to it, I feel like. Like in the beginning, when I was just starting, like I really just connected to what Bryan was saying. Like in the beginning, you take the opportunities that come to you. And part of that is coming to the terms with the fact that in one hand, I'm getting these opportunities because I'm Native. And then within that, I'm part Native. So I'm mixed. And so you have all these interesting identity issues layered on top of it. And so in the beginning, I was a little wary of like, am I going to be pigeonholed to only working on text by Native authors, which in itself isn't a bad thing, but is that all I'm going to, be, emailed about? But since then, I think that was a lot of times was just my insecurities of not feeling like I belonged to, not feeling Native enough. That's a common, I think, feeling with a lot of Indigenous people today, I think, and especially mixed. And so I think it was in large part coming from there. But then I started to gain a deeper appreciation for it and for these opportunities. And, I did see other texts written by non-Native authors, and I did have those opportunities, but I never connected to them in the same way. And so I've still exclusively worked on books by Native authors, and I've just come to appreciate that it is a really great responsibility and honor, and it might not always get me the readership or the audience of maybe doing a book about frogs, like you said, but there's just such a, oh gosh, it just is giving me such a purpose. And it always comes to mind when reading about Maurice Sendak, he's like, find what's at the white hot center of you, and really mind that. And so for me, now it's sort of been well, this is what I want to do, and these are the stories I want to tell. There's, I spoke about diversity within the Native community, which there is so much diversity, but I also feel like there's a lot of kinship across nation identities. And I felt that our Native Kidlit community is pretty tight knit and small and incredibly supportive. And I'm really honored to be in that group. And, now I've learned all these different things from working on all these different stories from all these different nations. And like you said, representation matters. And now I'm finally I'm able to work on my own books, writing my own stories, and just being able to bring in all those lessons that I've learned. It's just been really amazing. So on one hand, I think it is sort of expected to, but I don't feel in any way that it's mandatory. It can be nerve-wracking and anxiety-inducing sometimes, just all that pressure. But at the end of the day, I just try to remember that it's for those kids and for those Native kids who often feel like they are unimportant and not seen. And like you guys have touched on, it's for the non-Indigenous readers too, just to see these other communities, these other ways of life, and to know that they are equally important and have beautiful contributions and are contemporary and thriving still to this day.
Great. What about you, Vashti?
A really good question, because I think on one hand, I know what I like. I really like drawing little kids. I like drawing girls. There was a time where I worked as a graphic designer for a t-shirt company, and my boss kept saying, make it less feminine, make it less feminine. I was like, okay, let's unpack what you mean by feminine here, but we'll save that for another time. I just felt like when I got into working on kid stuff, I got to explore some of the things that I love the most. But to touch on what you're really asking about, there came a time after people came to know my work, and it felt like every offer I was getting was another issues book, a book that covered really heavy, heady subjects for children of color. And I mean, I know what I like. I want some fun adventures. So I do turn down a lot of those books that end up being about that really focus on some really difficult things. A book like Sulwe covers colorism, which is a really intense subject, but it takes the reader and it takes the protagonist on this really magical, whimsical journey. And to me, that's my entry point into it. So as much as I love telling these stories about Black girls, I'm not just going to say yes to every single one if it doesn't feel like I can add something to the story, or if it's if I'm not going to be able to access that that white hot power feeling of joy from my creative core. But another thing happened in that I was offered a book to illustrate, and I got the opportunity to do whatever I wanted. and the author was not Black. And I was asking these questions, like, is there an expectation that I'll make this a Black protagonist? Because there was nothing in the narrative that gave anything specific about a time or place, location, character, and there was so much freedom in what I could do with the setting and the characters. But I wondered, is there an expectation that since this is a Vashti Harrison book, that Vashti Harrison is going to make it fit into that category of the Hair Love, the Soulways, and the Little Leaders? And in the end, I made up my own story that fit within the narrative of like the little bits and pieces. And I pulled together a culture, and I decided, okay, I think this book is actually set in Houston, which is a very multicultural city. And I think that this character is from this descent. Like for me, it was more important to make sure that the character fit the story, and that there were elements that wove together to elevate and make the narrative feel more full, rather than just me slapping a Black character into the story. So like, as much as I value every opportunity to tell stories of Black girls and offer more nuance into that lexicon, I don't think, sometimes I worry about the expectation of what I'm going to offer. Like, I don't have like crazy star power, but I feel like there are expectations of what I'm going to bring to the table. So to me, it's important that I'm elevating the story in the best way possible for that kid reader. Like, okay, so now there's more texture here. Now there's deeper story. We can pick through these backgrounds and figure out what city we're in. And that will lead them to wonder, like, oh, okay, it's a book about space. The Johnson Space Center is located in Houston, Texas. That's interesting. Maybe her mom works at the Johnson Space Center. To me, that offers far more to the story than just me bringing, just because I'm the illustrator, that I'm going to bring my own culture. Like, to me, it's like, it should be emanating from the story itself.
Yeah, I like that quote about the white hot center.
Yeah.
That's a good takeaway. I know that with books that have people of color on the cover, the sales can be considerably compromised, or not compromised, but they're going to be less. You know what I mean? Because society, despite whatever lip service is given to diversity and, you know, being open and everything, might not put the dollars behind it, might not buy the books in the same way that they would a story about, you know, Captain Underpants or something that's more generic. Not to throw any shade on Captain Underpants, wonderful book. But my question is this: to what extent do you think about that? Because this is also business. It's business for all of you guys, and you know that having diverse characters doesn't mean that your topic is necessarily diverse. You know what I mean? You could be. I did a book about getting a lunchbox. There's a Black kid on the cover, so it becomes a Black book.
Right.
But it's about getting a lunchbox. Do you know what I mean? So, to what extent do you worry that, or do you worry at all, that your sales are going to be affected by the fact that you have diverse characters? Does that factor into your consideration when you're taking on a book?
Well, for me, I just learned early that stay true to the authentic self and let it fall where it may. And I learned on the job, because as an illustrator, you're alone most of the time making your work. You're isolated, and at some point you got to find joy. It has to be joyful in it, because nobody can help you. You know, the Caldecott you won last year can't help you. None of the awards and accolades and the money, none of that can help you. It is all on you, and anything that you don't do, it won't get done. So you find joys and places that excite you. And you find that in an authentic place within you. So all the other stuff, it doesn't hold true.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't hold true. And I know if you feel the joy, the energy that you put in it, it emanates once the work is out. You can see it. You can see the joy in it.
Mm-hmm.
It emanates for a kid that doesn't know you, that's on the other side of the planet. Then that energy is there. So stay true to it. Tell the truth. We're truth tellers in your work. So if you do that, everything for me falls into place.
At the risk of name dropping, when I was on the Daily Show with Trevor Noah, the first question he asked me was like, did you know that your books were going to be New York Times bestsellers? And I'm certain he was expecting me to say, oh my God, no, I had no idea. But like, I spent a lot of time like interacting with people on social media, and I knew that I had this very strong following of people who look like me, who were like, we are so ready for this book to come out. I pre-ordered it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's incredible value in making work for a specific group of people who is hungry for that work. So I have never worried about, I've had the luxury of not having to worry about that, because I started in this industry in a time where I could come with, a decent amount of my own following through social media. And after the hard work of so many folks working to make we need diverse books and open up the industry for people like me to come along. So I feel like I know that there's incredible value in putting a Black kid on that cover and saying like, hey fam, I made this for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to be able to see yourself in this. And that so when he asked me, I was like, no, I wasn't surprised, because I've been talking to these people and they're ready for it. But on the other hand, I will say I do every once in a while look at the bestsellers list and I see what picture books are always on there. And I think I'm trying to assess what is it that reaches all American, all people. And often it's books with creatures as protagonists, or a very diverse, or goodnight stories or something like that. So I am wondering, how can I bring something that features children of color into that more year round? I can count on February as a good time for my books, but I want to think about how to make those books more accessible, or at least more universal year round, outside of Black History Month and
Mm-hmm.
outside of Blackout Tuesdays after horrible events, so I do try to pay attention, because obviously this is a business and I want to make sure that I'm reaching as many children as possible. And so if that means assessing what makes an award winner or assessing what makes a bestseller, then I'm going to do that, because I'll always quote this. My mom did not buy books when I was a kid. They are $20 a piece. She did not buy me books. Fortunately, we had access to the library, but I totally understand that that is money to be spent, and not everybody has the ability to buy a book every month or a couple books every month. So what's going to make these books the one that people really want in their house all the time and make everybody want it? So I am trying to be very mindful of the business aspect of it.
Yeah.
I love that more business-minded approach, because I think we have to do that as just runners of our own little studios. So I mean, I've definitely thought about those issues as well, and had similar conversations, looking at, Vashti was just saying the top sellers, and just sort of coming to terms with the fact that Indigenous representation in the larger publishing world still has a long ways to go. And I would be the one that's very surprised if it was a New York Times bestseller for my books. But that being said, I would, like what Bryan was saying, I'm never going to let that stop me from doing this work. I think all the books I've worked on, and I haven't been doing this for very long, all of them have featured Native characters. That's what all the books I've worked on have been about. And they've been about such different things. So it's really amazing and inspiring. And I don't foresee myself changing it up anytime soon. I think it's more important that these kids can see themselves, and other people can see Indigenous kids on the cover, really proud and strong and just radiating power and beauty. That's more important to me, and I think that's more important to the work I want to leave behind and the body of work I want to craft moving forward. And I feel really lucky to be entering the industry at this time versus even 5 years ago, for Indigenous illustrators, there's just way more attention. And, you know, like the Black Lives Matter movement has really helped Indigenous people as well. Like, it's really helped our visibility and people's attention to issues that, you know, people have been fighting for a long time, but, you know, before now, there hasn't been as many receptive audiences. So, you know, I've thought about it, and kind of similar to what Vashti was saying, I've had like thoughts of how can I sort of find that sweet spot, and have maybe a little bit more of a mass appeal while staying true to the truth telling. I love that as well. I think it's an interesting area to explore, and it's really inspiring because I feel like there's so many untapped stories and such untapped potential there. And whereas before maybe I was a little bit resistant to writing what I know, like I remember when I first signed with my agent and had this first big editor, you know, and I was like, do you guys even want to hear my stories? They're so specific to my region, and like, so I don't perceive people really wanting to hear that beyond people in our region. And at first I was like kind of hesitant, but now I'm just really embracing that, because, you know, you can only really write the stories you know. And my formative years have really been here on the beaches and in the rainforests, and that's really what I want to write about and illustrate. So I think that will resonate far better than anything I did just for, you know, mass market appeal alone. Yeah, but it is an interesting thing to explore for sure.
Well, it's how we get to know each other. Do you know what I mean? So a child picks up a book about a Native person, and they learn something. They learn something they didn't know, or they get to know somebody. I think it's so important with children's books not to just introduce them to other cultures, but to break some stereotypes, some negative stereotypes that are out there as well. Do you know what I mean? When you get to know somebody, you realize, oh, they're very familiar. We don't have a lot of time left before I'm going to open it up to the floor, but I did want to ask how this pandemic is affecting you creatively. Like, how are you managing to work while this is going on, because you're separated basically from community? And are you finding there's any silver linings to this at all? Is there anything that's come out of this that you're finding has actually helped your work?
Well, for me, the current book that I'm working on right now is it's about two boys, but I have two daughters. I have three daughters, but I'm using the two younger ones as models, because normally I use kids in the neighborhood, but with the pandemic, nobody, that's not good. That's not a cool thing to do. So I just used my daughters and gave them boy haircuts.
Ooh, how do they feel about that? How old are they?
They are 6 and 9 years old.
Okay,
And,
that's not an age when they want, you know, they necessarily get along with boys.
Yeah, but you know, I just gave them boy haircuts, and they fit the character perfectly.
Okay.
And so we just press on. As artists, that's what you do. You make something work out of nothing, basically. You know, you make it work, whatever you have. So I'm good with that.
Okay, because I know you can be limited with like your materials and stuff. Vashti, you were talking about being limited with materials, you know, so what do? Do you find a brand new style?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I felt like a considerable amount of relief. I know that sounds crazy to say, but part of it was a big relief in that, like, a lot of my work, a lot of my time is spent alone and in isolation before the pandemic. And I thought, oh, wow, now everyone's at home and we're all doing our own little thing. And I felt like some kind of camaraderie with the rest of the world, and that we're all just trying to make this work. And I typically work digitally, so I really could just be on my computer and never need another tool. But I found a freedom of like, okay, the events are canceled, I don't have to go anywhere. Now I have some time to play with these pastels. Now I have some time to play with this collage and try to make images out of new media. And I was in an exploratory phase on a book, so I did find a lot of creativity. And then in May, at the end of May, when we saw the videos of George Floyd and Amy Cooper, just like this barrage of internet stuff, I just felt completely overwhelmed. I couldn't create, I couldn't go on social media, I couldn't really talk to people. And so it was a very much up and down, and I had to kind of, I think it was the fact that I had a deadline coming up that I just had to force myself to work. So I saw both the highs and the lows of all of it, but I'm getting back to, now that I'm at my parents' house and I do have only a limited amount of materials, I'm excited about the opportunity to try to create stuff with the paper and scraps and reuse materials to try to make something more tactile and step away from the computer, because I don't even have my big drawing tablet here. So yeah.
Michaela?
Well, I think like, yeah, we do spend a lot of time alone as artists. You know, my schedule didn't really shift a whole lot. I think just by living in a remote state, it's not like I travel a lot. I don't travel a lot for visits, school visits or conferences. It's just too expensive. And then a remote state and then a remote home, I was rarely going into town and would stay in our little property area for like weeks. And so I was sort of like adjusted to sheltering in place, and I already have to order all my supplies anyways, and I have, you know, large expense here, shipping and things like that. So, you know, like the practicals didn't change a whole lot. But then I missed already like a crazy year, roller coaster year for the world. We moved from that location to Sitka, Alaska, which is on an island, and that's not an easy move. My partner opened a brewery, so we had like this new business at the weirdest time, and I was helping him start that and developing like the visuals for that. And then like at my parents' house while we found another place. So for a lot of the year, we were just like in flux in all these transitions, and I didn't really have a home base. And I couldn't get back to my old studio and finish the move for months. And so it was just this kind of crazy feeling. And then like on a more personal note, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer back in July. Oh. And I'm fine. Like I had surgeries, and it's a pretty, you know, it's of the cancers to get, it's a very, one of the ones you want, you know, if you're going to have to get cancer, that's one of the ones you want to get. It has a better prognosis. But so that just was just a whole other level of transition. And now the first time, and we're already in November, like I'm done traveling and surgeries and moving. And I'm like, oh my God, how did it get to be in November? I've had this book I'm working on for, I'm supposed to be much farther along at this point. And, you know, for the most part, that's happening to a lot of people. So, you know, people have been really great about extensions and work extensions and things like that. And everyone's just pretty understanding. But my creativity has definitely suffered, and my productivity. You know, my online shop wasn't open for most of the year, it felt like, because of all the moves and just things like that. But, you know, now I'm finally excited to kind of hunker down, not have to travel, not have to have medical things. And yeah, so this year, I don't think it has had many positives personally. But it's been a year. But I think a lot has come from it. And yeah. I just think it's not super evident quite yet, if that makes sense. But I will say, working on this first book that I'm authoring and illustrating, it's based around berry picking, although that's not like what it's about, essentially. And it timed up when the season's well. We couldn't go out and mingle with people. Couldn't go out trying to make new friends here. But what I could go do was berry picking, and that in itself is like medicine here, just traditional foods and our wild lands. And so I think that it enabled me to get some deeper meanings or deeper levels on this book that I'm excited to finish.
Yeah, I felt like there were some silver linings, like Vashti. I felt like initially, like, oh goody, get to stay home and work and catch up on some deadlines, you know. And also when I talk to my students, because they're all illustrators, the fact that we can stay in and work on our art, and we have that sort of an outlet, is such a plus when you think about all the different types of professions you might be in. You know what I mean? You can hunker down and focus on your artwork. And truthfully, going to shows like the Original Art Show has been just such a godsend that you can sit at home and still see this artwork. And there's museums all over the world you can go visit virtually. So I just find this whole online thing, which I started to think of as a threat and horrifying and terrible and being dragged into it, as turning out to be something of a silver lining, you know, just by virtue of being able to see people through the pandemic. You know what I mean? So that part is a little bit of a rouse thing. I want to ask a real quick question before I open up to the floor, and that is in terms of the representation in publishing houses with the editors and the art directors and the marketing departments and stuff like that. Do you think that has an impact on our work at all, on the books at all that get published?
Oh, I think it has some impact, of sure. I mean, just the whole idea of a diverse background of the gatekeepers and the sensibility of imagery and text and what's offensive and what's not. You know, there has to be a gauge with everybody. I mean, all of us as a collective, and when we're working on a project, to really think about what it is and what we're projecting and what we're telling, the stories that we're telling, even if the intention is one thing, but when it comes out, it's something else. I think there's definitely needs to be more diversity within the ranks of a publishing house. I was fortunate enough when I first started to make books, and I was walking with my portfolio to different publishing houses. I went once a week, every week for 7 years till I got my first book deal. So I got a chance to see a lot of different publishing houses, the personality of the publishing houses. And at that point, and the feedback that I was getting was that they like the work, but we don't have any work for you as an illustrator. That's what they were saying with the response to the work. But that's code for saying we're not doing books of color. This is back 20 years ago.
Right.
And then you look at who the gatekeepers, who holding the keys, and then there's a lack of diversity there. But fortunately, things have changed. There was a void in the marketplace. There was a need. There was a thirst in the marketplace for books that we make, and the market recognized that. Everybody recognized that, and the doors started to open a little bit. But it's
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, it's not open enough.
Liam Lowe had a study that came out not long ago that was showing that it hasn't changed that much in like 20, 30 years in terms of percentages of books that are done that have diverse characters as the main subject. So hopefully things have changed. I certainly like this movement towards own voices. I think it makes sense, for all kids to be able to see all kids, and for nobody to be excluded. That's a healthy change. I am going to open it up to questions on the floor, and if anybody has questions they haven't put into the question window, they should put them in there. The first one I'm going to ask you, is there a vetting process that happens between you and the writer? I don't know that you guys actually deal with the writer before you potentially collaborate. Do any of you actually work with the writer first, or does it always come through the publishing house? And when you vet it, is there a time when you say this book is not for me?
I think the question assumes that most authors and illustrators work together and collaborate together, but that's not the case for most books in the publishing industry. We're often hired directly by the publishing house to illustrate a book, and so like as the illustrator, I communicate directly with the art director, who communicates with the editor, who communicates with the author. So in some cases, books I've illustrated, I've never met the author, but I know that on the publishing house side, they are trying to do a better job of pairing authors and illustrators, pairing projects to illustrators, finding the right illustrators to ask to illustrate a book, to support that the own voices movement. I don't, so I think the vetting often comes on their end in who they're like pulling together a list of artists for. So I think like in your question about like on the publishing side, how much has changed and how much can change, I think there's a long way to go. And one of the things that folks who are in the industry are doing is trying to open themselves up to realizing that, you know, I can spend a little extra time and find a Cherokee illustrator for this book, because there's definitely someone out there. There's got to be someone out there. So I think that's the kind of vetting that I think is really important, because I think the publishing house should be spending a lot of extra time on that.
And yeah, I agree too, because then if they're not doing that legwork, then it'll fall on the illustrator. Because you know, you're sometimes caught in the middle, like, should you have taken that book? Well, it's like, but I need to work, and I'm trying to work on my opportunities. I can't always afford to be the most discerning, like, as I'd want. Like, sometimes I see a story, I'm like, this should go to this illustrator. And you know, I have read a lot of texts and just like, I'm not right for that one. This would be way better suited to somebody, at least from an indigenous nation in that region more so. Because there's a lot of things in this text that I can just tell I would have to research a lot. And I don't know if the authenticity would come through. And sometimes I just know a text isn't right because if there's nothing about nature, really, then it's hard for me to connect to it, regardless of what it is. So I've turned some down just based on that alone, just because I knew it would really be hard for me to bring that passion into it. But yeah, what Vashti was saying is a lot of that vetting goes on behind the scenes before we're even brought in.
I
And
think the author can like submit like their ideal wish list, but there's no guarantee that like the publishing house will follow that.
It's very rare to have them come in as a team.
Right.
You know, I've heard about that happening a couple of times only.
There was that with me and Lupita though, but that was a different deal.
Oh, really?
She's special. I was a work for hire book, so I was hired directly. I was like, it was everything Lupita said went.
Okay. So this is what happens with the stars.
With the celebrities.
With the celebrities, okay. What Lupita wants, Lupita gets. Okay, I'm not surprised. Why am I not surprised? But I do have a question. Something you were bringing up, Michaela, when you were talking about it might not be right for you because of all the amount of research, you're not sure you're going to bring authenticity to it. What do you guys feel about people working outside of their culture? Like, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not you can illustrate something outside of your culture, if you can do enough research, if you can bring enough authenticity to something without being of the culture. What do you guys feel about that?
I think it's book by book basis, really. You know, for instance, on those texts that I saw or read and went, yeah, I thought about it, but I'm not right. Oftentimes the themes or the cores or like this important subject matter was something I had no experience with. However, the books that I have worked on, decided to take on, you know, I think every single book I've worked on, the authors have been like, it does not need to be, you know, rooted in my culture or our culture down here. Like, you can bring your own experiences into it. It's open. If we need to change some words, like, I'm open to that. And so I felt that was really liberating creatively, like, just to have that option. And so the books that I have worked on, for the most part, have just been dealing with bigger themes like environmental justice, or a love for home and land, or connection to land, and land is central to identity. They have those at the core, and so it allows us to meet in the middle. But ones that deal with, you know, like, I've read some that have more like specific to powwows or things down south that I wouldn't be the best fit for that. So if you say no to an opportunity, it can be hard, but it frees up something that may just come down the pipeline that you don't know yet. So
What about you, Bryan?
So
Vashti? Does it
yeah,
matter?
it's so funny. I've confronted those type of issues and over the years, and it happened with this particular book, with Martin's big words. Doreen, who's white, who wrote this text, beautifully done, and initially I just got the text, and it didn't matter who did it. It was a good text, and I loved it, and I wanted to know that about Dr. King beyond what's always been given to us every year over and over. It had to be something else in the story, and it allowed me to do research, go down and to Atlanta and Montgomery and do some really research and talk to people and get into the community. But then I found out what Doreen was a freedom writer, and so she has a skill set and a set of information that she lived through that applies to this particular text as well. So that helps. I just think that if you honor the text and you honor what it is you're bringing forth, and it's a part of you, and you can do it well, all the other, the race and all that stuff sort of fades from it, because you can feel when you're all in. And so that's my thing on that.
Vashti?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Bryan. I think I think as long as you're bringing honesty and truth to that character, we kind of talked about this in the panel we did at SCBWI about drawing race authentically. I don't think you have to be that specific race. I don't think if you're not Black, you can never draw a Black character. I think you just have to give honor and respect to that character is a real human being. Because to some kid reader, they are going to be as real as you or me. So I think it's just about giving as much specificity and honesty to that character as possible. But yeah, as an illustrator, there may be times where like there's a story that I'm inspired to tell, but I don't know if I have that experience. And I'm still sitting with it and still thinking about it. It is about a Black boy, and I don't know if I necessarily have the exact experience of that Black boy in growing up in a completely different cultural experience than I do. And so just because I'm Black doesn't necessarily mean I have every tool to tell that story, but I can continue to do my research and talk to people. I think that there are many opportunities to educate yourself to tell more stories. But on the flip side, I remember very distinctly after this Blackout Tuesday, and there was just after the killing of George Floyd, there was so much of a wave of talk about how to educate yourself on different people's experiences, specifically the Black experience in America. And a white illustrator posted, some sort of Black Lives Matter post, and a commenter asked that person, would you please illustrate a child of color in your next book? And I commented on it. Shouldn't have shouldn't have read the comments, but the argument that person was making was that they don't want to see more issues books, and that to them all Black books were issues books. And that, I think, is one of the huge problems with the lack of diversity in publishing. Often, I'm sure Bryan and Michaela is doing all of these water protector books, social justice books. There may come a time when all of us are continually asked to illustrate these issues books, and sometimes we just want to draw a book about a kid having a day at the beach with his best friend, imaginary friend, and so that's what this person was asking of this famous white illustrator. And I just felt so heartbroken, because we want to tell those stories. We want to have the opportunity to tell those stories. And that's what we're asking for, is more diversity and more space in the publishing industry to tell more and different stories. So yeah, of course that white illustrator could do a book like that. Yeah. But I would recommend the people who are out there buying books to diversify your bookshelf. Don't, if you've got books with people of color on them and they're all about someone marching or going to jail or being killed, maybe just look for one that's about an adventure, because that will help your yourself and your kid reader as just as much, because again, it's about those windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors.
I think that's part of the stereotype that we're up against too, is that the minute you see that face of color on the cover, you think it's an issue. It can't be about just having a good day.
And the concern was that they didn't want to read another sad book. They didn't want their kid to read another sad book. It's like, bro, I don't want to illustrate sad books.
Exactly. That's the assumption, because that's a person who has not actually opened the book and actually read the book to see what is in the, what the content is. One of the best quotes I had heard about that was a million years ago. Nancy Larrick wrote in the Horn book that if you had to stick to your culture, Peter Rabbit would have never gotten written. Would have to have been written by a bunny, So you ought to be able to have access to anything. Like you said, as long as you do your research, you do your homework, and you feel like you can bring some authenticity to it. One of the questions, I think this is kind of cute, from an anonymous attendee who has said that they hadn't thought about this before, but the artist, really the last line, they interpret the book in ways the writer might not have thought of. And if so, that's a great thing for us to consider. Illustrators should not be second billing for a book. I have a feeling this is an author. And, before you guys even answer, I want to say they're called picture books. Do you know what I mean? And illustrators are definitely half of the ticket. But do you guys ever feel like the books are always about the writing and you guys get second billing when you're doing a book? Do you feel that way? Or do you feel like you're really 50-50?
No, I'm even more than 50-50 when I'm doing the book. And that's just in my own head. I just said, okay, this is my book. I'm gonna get into this one and really drive this one home. And but I do realize I am considered of the writer, and but I just realized that I think my job is to do the text, stay true to the text, but also expand the idea of it, and sort of bring to the table something that wasn't quite considered. Because, like I said, the words sound different to me. They taste different. They look different. They feel different when I'm reading over and over this text to try to hear the essence of it. And that's the beauty of reading and this whole orchestra of ideas, how it'll fall on somebody differently. They'll hear something else in the text. That's an expansion. So that's just sort of what happens in the dynamics of illustrating a book and working with, collaborating with it. That's why they keep us apart too, that collaboration, because too many cooks in the kitchen thing happens as well. So
yeah. Well, pictures are definitely, I think a large part of the book. And if you have an author who has said, this is my experience, if the author has said, this is a 5-year-old girl who has brown braids and lives in the suburbs, the editor would never say that to you. They would say, how old do you see this girl? And you'd say, oh, I don't know, 5, 6, 7. They say, 5's great, why don't we go with 5? And then they say, well, what does she look like? Oh, I don't know, maybe a little redhead, maybe this, maybe she got cornrows, whatever. And you kind of get steered maybe towards the direction that the author was thinking of, but they would never say to you, the author says,
right,
this is the setting. You can't draw what's in somebody else's head. It's just not possible. So in terms of the illustration, you guys, we have questions about people who are getting started in illustration. Do you want to talk about your craft, about what you do to stay nimble, to keep developing your craft? Because I know that it's not over. Like, once you get your first book, you're not done. Everybody that I know anyway keeps learning and keeps going to classes or programs or trying new materials. What do you guys do to keep your work fresh and always learning?
I think the materials is huge, because even if you just say, I'm going to try some more colored pencil, you have to do so much. At least I've been trying to incorporate more medium besides watercolor. And as soon as I do that, I start to widen my library, or start to look at all other contemporary artists who I admire, or past illustrators, and I start to really analyze. And so you're always learning, and you have to keep trying to learn new things, I think, to keep from getting bored. Or maybe bored isn't the right word. It's maybe like falling falling back on your safety net. So, you know, for water protectors, it came at a time where I was painting water all the time. And then I got done with water protectors and I just painted water like every single spread. And it was really fun, but all my work started to feel like I'm using the same blue greens, I'm using the same washes, the same kinds of techniques. And I just started to kind of feel listless with that, I guess. And then this past year, it's been fun. I'm feeling a little bit called to trying more pastels and pencils. And for the first time, I'm drawn to more earth tones and not as much. So, you know, just trying to follow those where you're, or just follow where your intuition's trying to take you. And it makes it so that each book is a new experience and a new learning experience. So yeah, classes, I think it's just experimentation and giving yourself the permission. And I think knowing too that, I mean, I always feel like, you know, there's always a bit of that fraud or that imposter syndrome, I think, with creative people. And I think it helps push me, you know, in a good dose. It keeps you on your toes, keeps you pushing to be better and do better. It can cross over the line sometimes, but yeah, I think new medium is the big one for me.
New mediums. Anything else? Because you're always, when you start a new book, you're facing this blank sheet of white paper, you know, and I'm assuming that everybody works in the same fashion. We're starting off with thumbnails and then doing a dummy and working their way up. But are there pages that you just can't wait to get to? Or are there pages that you feel like, I don't want to do this one, I have to go back to the drawing board and come up with something fresh or challenging? How do you approach it? How do you get started? And how do you keep yourself like excited on every page?
Me? Oh, I'll go.
Yeah.
At least I think due to like the amount of projects that I had all at the same time, I chose to do everything digitally because that's the way I worked fastest. But as I've had more time and freedom to experiment with other books, I mean, I've had the opportunity to showcase these different styles. And I personally feel like I draw differently when I use different tools. So if you know, I'm feeling so overwhelmed with one medium, I'll switch to another just to keep myself fresh. And quite honestly, I didn't study illustration, so I still feel like I'm educating myself every day, trying to learn something new and teach myself more techniques and more styles. This kind of reflects on your last question. Like, folks often think that we're just translating what's on the page, and kind of like Bryan said, I think of what we do is like extending the story into a different medium. And so there's often this assumption that we're just these like drawing robots. It just happens and it just comes out. And it's like, no, we're putting a lot of time and work into this stuff. Sometimes we're thinking about things that, you know, the author may not have thought about. Like, you know, when you say if like the quote on the page is like, the room was filled with junk, we have to draw that junk. So we have to think about what that junk is and how it's specific to that character and what's underneath their bed and what did they stick in between the cracks in the couch. So to me, it's always just forcing myself to try new things, and books will make you do that to keep the creativity fresh and keep the drawing fresh, and also life drawing and practicing hands all the time.
It never ends. What about you, Bryan?
Yeah, for me, I let the text dictate the tone. Like every book for me has a different color, an overall color.
Mm-hmm.
So I let that sort of dictate how I do. Now, often I do watercolor and collage. Now, the way I sort of varied up is some books have more collage than watercolor, and some just the opposite, because the text is prompting me to do it. It's not an overt prompt, but it's a prompt, and aesthetically, you know, the texture of the text says, well, we need more collage. It feels more collage, and the collage for me is not just a technique. It's a metaphor for life. It's about bringing different objects and ideas together to make something whole or make something one. And and I was influenced by a quilt maker, which was my grandmother. So when you look at the artwork, you can see the influence of a quilt maker.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the whole, I back up from all of it and look at myself as an artist and say, well, wait a minute. My journey through life is to try to become whole, because we're all broken somewhere.
Yeah.
That's the truth of us. We're trying to be mended and whole. So that metaphor, that collage metaphor, plays into the art that I make as well as our lives. So the struggle and the joy for me is figuring out that puzzle, that piecing together, and what that feels like, and what that is in relationship to the text. So that means there's a whole spectrum of ideas and approaches that I take, and I let the text dictate it, and then look around the world that we're in, dictate it. You know, the energy and all that stuff around me as well. So it's a bunch of things, you know.
Well, that's one of the loveliest things about books, is like every book is different. And so it
Yes.
brings you to a different experience. And sometimes you need to pick up a different medium. You know, you never know. I'm going to ask you guys one last question about just some advice that you can give to people who want to do books. But before I do that, I just want to say, support diverse books. Pick them up. Take a look at them. Check them out from the library. Buy them. Give them as gifts to other people. There's so much more between the pages than you might think just by looking at the cover. I know you can judge a book by the cover sometimes, but open them up and take a look at what's inside of them. I do want a last word of advice to anybody who wants to do books or who is doing books and wants to grow and do more books. Each one of you, a very short piece of advice, or maybe what's the best advice you ever got that you might want to pass along. Bryan, you want to start?
The best advice I got was in the very beginning, with one of the first books that I did, and it was from Andrea Pinkney. She said, go for the hills on every page. Don't hold back on not one thing ever. Just shoot for the stars.
Yeah.
Dream it, and don't get talked out of your dreams. You know, even when it feels doubtful, trust yourself and go for it.
Good advice. Michaela?
She's
You're muted, Michaela.
You're muted.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I would have
And
kept
it was
going.
beautiful. That was beautiful.
I think, you know, for me, how I got started was just a passion and an interest for it. And then I looked for those local opportunities, you know, instead of trying to be like, oh, I want to be on this, I want a book with this huge publisher. And just, that felt so insurmountable. Like, how can I ever do that? So I think sometimes looking for local opportunities helps you sort of break it down into those more maybe seemingly attainable goals. And then that really helps build your experience. Like my first books for the local opportunities, I mean, I cherish them, but if you compare like where I started and where I am now, like it's pretty evident. So it's neat to see that journey in a very public way, but you know, it's just part of the journey. So those local opportunities are great because you never know where they'll go. And then like to bring it back to that white hot center quote, when I read that, you know, that really helped me figure out what I wanted to write about. What stories did I actually want to tell? And, you know, I can try to do this, or I can try to be like this person or like that storyteller. But if I'm truly wanting to, you know, figure out what's at the core of me, it's like, I looked back, some advice I got was to look back at everything that you were obsessed with as a kid and trying to find the common themes, whether it was movies or books or film or animation. What were you drawn to the most? Like, what do you still remember and why? And then try kind of analyze that and figure out ways that you can bring that into your work. And then you'll always sort of have a really authentic place that you're coming from. And I think that hopefully that comes through.
Yeah. You want to have some passion about what it is you're working on. Vashti, what about you?
The thing I usually I usually bring it back to this Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop quote that books can be windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And I always ask people when you're creating something to keep in mind that if you're working on a kid's book, that the end goal is to share this with a young reader. So who gets to see themselves in your story, and will this function as a mirror, a sliding glass door, or a window, a mirror, or a sliding glass door for those kids? And if so, why? And if not, why? I think, you know, so much of what we do on like the publishing side is often about marketing, and is the text legible from the Instagram square? Like, it's so much about business, but the kid reader should always stay in our minds. So that's my main thing that I try to like keep at the forefront, because, you know, what inspired me often was thinking about what books I liked as a kid, what books inspired me as a kid, and what books I would have needed as a kid. And, you know, I worry a lot about the kids that are growing up right now. Like, they are seeing so much amazing, like, diversity in children's books, but also they're experiencing crazy amounts of stuff going on in the news. So I think a lot about, like, what do they need right now? Or what are they going to need actually in 2 years? Because that's when the book's going to come out. But for the artists, I always think about this quote from Walt Stanchfield, who was an educator at the Disney Studios. He said, "We all have 10,000 bad drawings inside of us. The sooner you get them out, the better." That's like very akin to like the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours. But I feel like I like the way he phrases it, because it suggests that like the bad stuff in those drawings, that's not a part of you. You just got to get it out, and you got to like put in the time and put in the work, and eventually you'll get there. And each drawing is a step in the journey towards becoming the artist that you want to be. So I think that with work and with time, you'll get there. So
That's great.
I hope that helps.
Okay. Okay. Well, one quote that I heard that I thought was fabulous was from Ayn Rand, and she said, "Don't wonder about, you know, who's going to let you do it. Who's going to stop you? You know,
Yes.
you need to change your thinking to who's going to stop you." I want to encourage everybody to take a look at the show, at the Original Art Show, and to go to the store and buy the catalog from it when it comes out, when the catalog is ready. If you put your name into their mailing list, they'll let you know when the catalog is available. Because the one thing I love about this show, and the reason that I take my classes, is because when you're looking at the art, you can also see who the art director and the editor was for each one of those books. If you're ever trying to send your work into somebody, this is the one-stop shopping. This is the place to find that out. So I really encourage you all to do that. I want to thank you guys. You were fabulous panelists. You were inspirational. I do believe everything rubs off. I'm going to go do a digital collage in ocean blue colors now. I'm motivated. But you guys have really been fabulous. And I thank the audience for tuning in and for the great questions we didn't get to. I'm sure that these questions will get answered. You can go to these folks' websites or follow them on all kinds of social media, and you can probably ask them the questions yourself. But thank you guys so much for taking the time and being so forthcoming with this information, and for your beautiful work that continues to inspire.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Okay.